AMD's new 8000 series of APUs have now come out, being processors that have their own built-in graphics that is fast enough for gaming. And I'm disappointed with them. What I was hoping for was some capable budget gaming options, ones that would really lower the cost barrier to PC gaming. But instead of that, we get some fast mid-range processors with more graphical power than most of them will ever be used for. Let me give you an example of an APU done right. The Ryzen 2200G. 4 solid, but not spectacularly fast processor cores, but paired with enough graphics power at the time to run any game at low settings and resolutions. So not exciting, but perfectly balanced and only costing $100. That's the key bit right there. This is a very price sensitive kind of product, and a lot of people seem to miss this point. They look at an APU like the 2200G and say, well, it would be nice if it had multi-threading and more graphics performance, and by the time they're done with it, the resulting product would become so expensive that it no longer makes sense. Because at $100, the Ryzen 2200G had no rivals, yet its bigger brother, the Ryzen 2400G, with its 8 threads and slightly more graphics processing power, looked like a decent improvement, on paper. However, at $170, it was already priced high enough to be in trouble. It now had to compete against all kinds of weird processor and graphics card combinations. But the Ryzen 2200G, it had no competition because at just $100, nothing else could really compete with it. Its processor was as fast as any $100 processor was, and its graphics was as fast as any $100 graphics card was. You were essentially getting a $100 component for free. Plus, it was power efficient and new, which made it a brilliant little APU, even if both parts of it were based on slightly outdated technology. Since then, both AMD's processors and graphics technologies have improved massively, and these new APUs contain the cutting-edge tech for both. But the problem now is its price. Even the cheaper Ryzen 8600G costs more than the 2400G did, $230. What we get for that is a great processor, but not enough graphics card, because for $230 it's putting itself perilously close to the cost of a cheaper processor paired with a much more capable dedicated graphics card, like the Radeon 6500 XT. Nobody liked this card, every review of it slated it for being the worst graphics card ever to exist and so on, but what if we don't compare it against other graphics cards? What if it's compared to APUs instead? Hardware Unboxed did exactly this in their review of the Ryzen 8700G. They were especially critical of the 6500 XT when it first came out, but in this newer video they make it pretty clear that it's a better option for gaming than these new APUs are, provided the graphics card is coupled with a PCIe 4 capable platform like Intel's 12100F is. So there you have it. The Radeon 6500 XT is a terrible graphics card, and still a ripoff at $150, but it lets you game as fast as the 8700G does, but for the price of the 8600G, which is brutal. Unfortunately, most reviews are focused on the more expensive 8700G and not the cheaper and much more interesting 8600G, which costs just $230 instead of $330. And Antec has benchmarked both, and it shows that the 8600G still retains a lot of the 8700G's gaming performance. But like I said, the price is the problem, and the fact that the 6500 XT and Intel 12100F can be had for $250, and that combo can beat the faster 8700G already, and that makes even the cheaper 8600G dead in the water for gaming. How AMD are marketing these new APUs tells us everything. They compare the 8700G against the Intel 13400F and a GeForce 1650. Nobody looking to build a gaming rig would consider combining these two components together. It would be far better to cut costs on the processor and to invest more into a better graphics card instead. Because in its current combination, the processor is excellent for productivity, just like the 8700G is. And the GeForce 1650 is underpowered for gaming, just like the 8700G is. When making this video, alarm bells were ringing. I know I have a point, but I highly expect some of you to be like, Philip, these things were never intended for gaming in the first place. Which is clear when you read the small print and see which components they're comparing it against. It spells out that these APUs are a processor first and foremost, with decent graphics performance being a secondary consideration. But all that goes against what made AMD's earlier generations of APUs so special. And look at how this slide is marketed. Incredible gaming value, smooth, full HD gaming. That opens them up to this sort of criticism, I think. So no, I feel justified in making this video when AMD themselves are trying to claim great gaming value whilst not actually offering it against a more sensible gaming build of similar price. But they could be, and that's what infuriates me. If only AMD weren't so quick to nerf it as we moved down the APU product stack. I went on Part Picker and created some approximately priced builds to demonstrate the situation. These two are the most expensive and are merely the AMD comparison that they did, just to compare the prices of these two, and in this comparison the 8700G looks rather good. But neither of these setups make much sense for gaming, so let's remove them and look at what's left. Now of these, the 8600G is the cheapest option, but only just, because for about $7 more, you'd get a much better gaming option with the Intel 12100F coupled with the 6500 XT. A Ryzen 5600 would be more powerful, but it costs a bit more as well, and I wouldn't deem it worthwhile for a budget gaming build, especially when for a similar price, you could stick with the 12100F instead and upgrade the 6500 XT to the Radeon 6600. And what you'd be left with is a gaming setup that utterly blows all these other budget options out of the water. When doing this part picking, a few things surprised me, and it all worked in the Ryzen 8600G's favour. Firstly, AM5 motherboards and DDR5 RAM were not as expensive as I thought, and the price of the older motherboards for the other setups seemed to have crept up in price. And yet despite all that, the 8600G build remained the inferior value for gaming. In its defence, the AM5 platform is very upgradable. The processor performance is also excellent, and far better than, say, the Intel 12100F is. If you prioritise productivity over gaming, but still like the option to be able to game, then the 8600G is probably the best option for its price. From their other slides, AMD seems to be implying that these processors are intended for small form factor desktops where a dedicated graphics card isn't an option. If you really had to build a gaming system in this particular form factor, which combines the hassle of a desktop with the space restrictions of a handheld, then sure. But then the Ryzen 2200G managed this same thing years ago for a fraction of the cost. The 8600G would have been a brilliant option to have maybe about 2 years ago when all graphics card prices were massively inflated. There was a time when the 6500 XT cost the same as this APU did, and I'd have said just to get the 8600G as a gaming stopgap until graphics card prices improved. But graphics card prices have now dropped, and to be able to get a system that's between 2 to 3 times faster in gaming for just $50 more, it kills the Ryzen APU value proposition. So what would these new Ryzen APUs have to do to make sense for budget gaming? Well, for a start, they need to cost a lot less. And frustratingly, while they do have a few cheaper options, none of these are ideal for budget gaming either, because with them, AMD seems happy to cut the number of graphics cores long before they dare consider dropping the number of processor cores. Which is annoying because the processor side of things is overkill for budget gaming needs. They could easily drop from 6 to 4 cores, and the processor in these things would still be formidable. So first we see the Ryzen 8500G, which at $180 is priced much better. But in my opinion, with just 4 gaming compute units remaining, they've cut the graphics too much, while they haven't cut the processor as much as they could have done. And then at the bottom of the stack is the Ryzen 8300G, which doesn't even have a price. But in my opinion, this has the potential to be an excellent budget gaming option. You can see it now only has 4 processor cores, and 3 of these are the slightly cut down, slower clocked Zen 4C cores. But given the speed of Zen 4, this should still be fine for a budget gaming build. But alas, if we move over to the graphics side of things, they've cut it down too much, with just 4 compute units remaining. Even the Ryzen 2200G and Steam Deck have 8 of these things. Now I get that RDNA 3's compute units may be superior, but had they still kept at least 6 of these and priced the processor at about $130, then maybe, just maybe, this could have been the ideal new budget gaming build, and priced low enough to not have to compete with dedicated graphics card setups. Ultimately, when it comes to budget gaming, handhelds reign supreme. It's still hard to argue with the value proposition of a Steam Deck, being a fully fledged gaming system with screen, controls, operating system and battery to boot. But there's still something to be said for the raw power of a desktop PC.